Edward Sterling had built his life on control. Every decision, every investment, every carefully calculated move had led him to success beyond imagination. He was a man who knew the rules of power and played them better than anyone. But all of that unraveled in an instant the moment he saw her. Standing in the lobby of an exclusive resort, holding the hand of a little girl with familiar blue eyes, was the one person he never expected to see again, Clara, his ex-wife, And the child? She was the right age. The resemblance was unmistakable. A cold realization settled in his chest. Had Clara been hiding something from him all these years? Had he unknowingly walked past his own daughter without even knowing she existed? Edward Sterling had never been a man who looked back. His entire life was built on moving forward, on making decisions without hesitation, on always knowing what came next. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, creating an empire out of sheer willpower and discipline. To the outside world, he had everything: a multi-million-dollar business, power, influence, and the ability to walk into any room and command respect. But as he sat in the luxurious lobby of the seaside resort, nursing a glass of whiskey and letting the low hum of conversation drift around him, he felt something unusual creeping in, the unfamiliar weight of exhaustion. He had come here under the pretense of taking a rare break, though he knew himself well enough to admit that he was already thinking about the meetings he would return to, the deals waiting to be finalized, the phone calls that needed to be made. Relaxation was not something he excelled at. He took another sip, exhaling slowly as he glanced toward the entrance. That was when he saw her. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. The woman who stepped through the revolving door looked too much like a ghost from his past, someone he had convinced himself he would never see again. She moved with the same quiet grace, her dark brown hair cascading over her shoulders as she adjusted the small child in her arms. The sight made something deep inside him tighten. Clara. For a moment, he just stared, unable to process what he was seeing. She looked almost the same as she had 3 years ago, beautiful, poised, but with a new layer of exhaustion in her features. The only thing more shocking than seeing her here, of all places, was the child she was carrying. A little girl, no older than 3, with her arms wrapped tightly around Clara's neck, burying her face into her mother's shoulder. Edward felt his grip tighten around the glass in his hand. His heartbeat, steady and controlled just moments ago, now pounded with an urgency he couldn't explain. He hadn't seen Clara since their marriage ended. Their divorce had been quiet, clean, without any dramatic courtroom battles or lingering arguments. She had left, and he had let her go, telling himself it was for the best. He had drowned himself in work, convinced that whatever they had once shared had been nothing more than a distraction. He had moved on. Or at least, that was what he had always told himself. But seeing her now, with a child who seemed far too close in age to the moment she had walked out of his life, something cold settled into his stomach. Was this her daughter? And if so, why did he have the sickening feeling that he already knew the answer? Clara walked toward the reception desk, shifting the child slightly in her arms as she spoke to the hotel staff. Edward barely registered anything else in the room. The voices around him faded, the music playing softly through the speakers became nothing but background noise. All he could focus on was the undeniable familiarity of the little girl's features, even from a distance. A sharp sense of urgency gripped him, an instinct he had never quite felt before. He needed to talk to her. Needed answers. But before he could move, before he could force himself to stand, Clara was already walking toward the elevator, holding the child close as she disappeared behind the closing doors. Edward remained frozen in place, staring at the empty space where she had been. The carefully controlled life he had built for himself had never felt more uncertain. Edward barely slept that night. No matter how much he tried to push the image of Clara and the little girl from his mind, it kept resurfacing, demanding his attention. He had spent years perfecting the art of compartmentalization, keeping his emotions locked away in favor of logic and control. But tonight, his mind was a battlefield of questions, none of which had answers. Was the child hers? That much was obvious. The way the girl clung to her, the protective way Clara held her, it left no doubt. But the real question, the one that refused to leave his thoughts, was the one he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Was she his? The thought sent a strange kind of panic through him, one he wasn't accustomed to feeling. If Clara had a child, his child, why had she never told him? Had she truly believed he didn't deserve to know? Or worse, had she thought he wouldn't care? By the time the first hints of sunlight filtered through his suite's floor-to-ceiling windows, Edward had made his decision. He wasn't going to spend another second lost in speculation. He needed answers, and he was going to get them. After a quick shower and a change into one of his tailored suits, because no matter the situation, he always needed to be in control, he headed downstairs. He had no idea if Clara would still be in the hotel, but something in his gut told him she hadn't left. She wouldn't have come to a place like this for just a single night. He made his way toward the restaurant, scanning the room as he stepped inside. The resort catered to the wealthy, the kind of people who took vacations in the middle of the week without a second thought. But Edward wasn't looking for them. His eyes landed on a small table near the terrace, where Clara sat with the little girl beside her. His pulse quickened at the sight of them together in the daylight. Clara looked just as stunning as she always had, her dark brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, a casual elegance in the way she held herself. The child, Lily, if he remembered correctly from the name the receptionist had spoken the night before, sat quietly, swinging her small legs under the table as she ate a piece of toast. It was the first time Edward had truly gotten a good look at her, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. She had blue eyes. His blue eyes. There was no denying it now. Taking a steadying breath, he stepped forward, moving toward their table with purpose. Clara noticed him before he spoke. Her body tensed immediately, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. She glanced at Lily, then back at him, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," Edward said, keeping his voice low and controlled. Clara hesitated, glancing at Lily again before nodding. "Not here," she murmured. "Meet me outside in 15 minutes. Edward nodded, then turned and walked away, not wanting to cause a scene. He could feel his pulse pounding, his emotions tightly coiled beneath the surface. 15 minutes later, he stood near the quiet garden terrace at the edge of the resort, hands in his pockets, staring out at the ocean. The crashing waves did little to calm the storm raging inside him. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Clara standing there, arms crossed, her expression guarded. Edward took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. "Is she mine?" Clara flinched slightly, her eyes flashing with something unreadable. She exhaled, looking down for a moment before meeting his gaze. "Yes," she said softly. "She's yours." The world seemed to tilt beneath him. 3 years. 3 years, and he had never known. And now, nothing in his life would ever be the same. Edward stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the weight of Clara's words. She had said it so simply, so quietly, but the impact hit him with the force of a tidal wave. Lily was his daughter. His hands tightened in his pockets as he forced himself to breathe evenly. 1,000 emotions warred within him, shock, anger, disbelief, but beneath all of it was something deeper, something raw. He had a child. And he had never even known. Clara shifted uncomfortably, clearly anticipating his reaction. Her arms were still crossed, as if bracing for whatever was coming next. "How could you not tell me?" His voice was low, but there was no missing the edge in it. Clara exhaled sharply, rubbing her forehead before meeting his gaze. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Edward. I never wanted to keep her from you, but by the time I found out I was pregnant, we were already falling apart. You were so consumed with work, so distant. I didn't know how to reach you. His jaw tightened. So you just decided for me? You thought I wouldn't care? Her eyes flashed with something close to frustration. I thought you would feel obligated. That you'd stay out of responsibility, not because you wanted to. And I didn't want Lily to grow up thinking she was a burden. Edward let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You thought keeping her a secret was the better option? I thought I was protecting her, Clara said firmly. Protecting both of us. You have no idea how hard it was to make that choice, but at the time, it felt like the only one I had. Edward ran a hand down his face, trying to ground himself. He had built his entire life on logic, on control, on making calculated decisions. But this was something he had never accounted for. She's 3, he finally said, his voice quieter now. 3 years of her life, gone. Years I'll never get back. Clara's face softened, and for the first time, there was something like regret in her expression. I know, she admitted. And I won't try to justify it. But Edward. I never planned to keep her from you forever. He looked at her sharply. Then why didn't you ever reach out? Clara hesitated, exhaling slowly. Because I was afraid that if I did, you would take her from me. The words stunned him into silence. He stared at her, trying to comprehend what she had just said. I wouldn't have done that, he said, his voice tight. Clara held his gaze, her expression filled with something unreadable. Wouldn't you? Edward swallowed hard. If he was being honest with himself, he didn't know what he would have done back then. He had been ruthless in his career, relentless in his pursuit of success. Would he have fought for custody? Would he have tried to control the situation in the way he controlled everything else in his life? Maybe Clara had a point. Maybe he hadn't been the man she could trust with something as fragile as a child. But he wasn't that man anymore. I want to see her, he said finally, his voice steady. I want to get to know my daughter. Clara searched his face for a long moment, as if weighing whether she could believe him. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay, she said softly. But we do this on Lily's terms. She doesn't know you, Edward. You can't just walk into her life and expect everything to fall into place overnight. He nodded, understanding. I don't expect that, he said. But I'm not going anywhere this time. Clara studied him, and for the first time, he saw something shift in her expression. The guarded walls weren't completely gone, but there was a crack in them now, a small opening. Then we start slow, she said. One step at a time. Edward nodded again, his chest tight with emotions he wasn't sure how to process. He had spent years believing he had no family, that his legacy was the empire he had built. Now, for the first time, he realized he had been wrong. And he was going to do whatever it took to make up for the time he had lost. Edward had never been nervous before. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals, stood in boardrooms with the most ruthless executives, and navigated crises that would have broken lesser men. But as he stood outside the hotel's garden terrace, waiting for Clara to bring Lily, he felt something unfamiliar twisting in his chest. How did you introduce yourself to a daughter who didn't even know you existed? Clara had made it clear, this would be a slow process, on Lily's terms. Edward understood that. He wasn't expecting her to run into his arms or call him Dad overnight. But the weight of the moment still pressed down on him. He had already lost 3 years. He wasn't going to waste another second. The sound of soft footsteps made him turn. Clara was walking toward him, her posture tense but composed, her dark eyes unreadable. And beside her, clutching her hand tightly, was Lily. Edward's breath caught in his throat. She was so small, barely reaching Clara's waist. Her dark curls bounced slightly as she walked, and those blue eyes, the same ones he saw in the mirror every morning, were wide with quiet curiosity. She clung to her mother's fingers, as if unsure of the new situation she had just been brought into. Clara knelt beside Lily and spoke softly. "Sweetheart, this is Edward. He's a friend of mine." Edward felt a sting at the word friend, but he didn't react. He understood why Clara had said it. Calling him her father outright might have been too overwhelming. Lily looked up at him, her head tilting slightly, as if studying a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She didn't say anything right away, just blinked up at him with those impossibly big eyes. Edward crouched down to her level, keeping his movements slow and careful. "Hi, Lily," he said gently. "It's really nice to meet you." Lily shifted slightly, looking at Clara as if for reassurance. When her mother nodded, she finally spoke. "Hi." It was just one word, small and uncertain, but it made something inside Edward tighten. He smiled, trying to put her at ease. "I heard you like puzzles. Is that true?" Lily's eyes flickered with a hint of interest. She nodded slowly. "I'm not very good at them," Edward admitted, keeping his tone light. "Maybe you could teach me sometime." Lily glanced at Clara again, as if checking to see if this was okay. Then, after a moment, she nodded once more. Edward let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Clara straightened, brushing her hand lightly over Lily's curls. "Why don't we sit?" she suggested, leading them toward a shaded area with a small table and chairs. Edward followed, his mind still reeling from the reality of it all. He had a daughter. And she was sitting right in front of him, playing with the hem of her dress while sneaking curious glances at him. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a small coloring book and a set of crayons, placing them in front of Lily. "You can color while we talk, okay?" Lily nodded, opening the book and carefully selecting a blue crayon. Edward watched her for a moment before speaking again. "What's your favorite color?" Lily didn't look up, but she answered quietly, "Purple." He smiled. "That's a good choice. It's a strong color." Lily glanced at him again, this time holding his gaze for a second longer before turning back to her page. Edward exhaled, shifting slightly in his seat. He had expected awkwardness, but now that he was here, actually sitting with her, he realized just how much work he had ahead of him. Clara must have sensed his thoughts because she spoke up softly. "She's shy around new people." Edward nodded. "That's okay. We'll go at her pace." Lily continued coloring, and Edward took the moment to really look at her. The delicate features, the way she bit her lip in concentration, the soft curl of her fingers as she gripped the crayon, it was surreal to think that this little girl was his. That he had missed her first steps, her first words, the little milestones that parents cherished. But he wasn't going to miss anything else. After a while, Lily set her crayon down and looked up at him. "Do you have a favorite color?" Edward smiled at the small but significant moment. "I think I do now," he said. "Purple sounds pretty good." Lily studied him for a second, then nodded as if approving his answer. Clara watched the interaction, something softening in her expression. Edward knew this was only the beginning, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Edward had never known time to move so slowly and so quickly all at once. The days following his first meeting with Lily were a delicate balancing act, each interaction carefully measured, each moment carrying more weight than he had ever anticipated. He had built his career on decisiveness, on taking control, on making things happen exactly when and how he wanted. But this wasn't a business deal. This was his daughter. And there was no strategy that could make up for lost time. He and Clara had settled into a tentative routine. Every morning, he met them for breakfast at the hotel's restaurant, sitting across from Lily as she ate her toast with precise little bites. She was still shy around him, still unsure of who he was supposed to be in her world, but she had begun to let him in. At first, it was small things, glancing up at him when he spoke, nodding in response to his questions. Then, she started to tell him little details about her day, like how she had seen a funny-looking bird outside their hotel window or how she didn't like the orange juice because it was too sour. He held on to every word. One afternoon, as he and Clara sat on a shaded terrace while Lily played with a small set of toys at their feet, he finally let himself ask the question that had been gnawing at him since the moment he learned the truth. "Why did you come here, Clara?" She didn't look at him right away. She kept her gaze on Lily, watching as their daughter carefully stacked small plastic cups into a tower. "We needed a break," she said after a moment. "Things at home, they've been hard." Edward studied her, noting the tension in her shoulders. He had known Clara well enough once to recognize when she was holding something back. "Hard how?" he pressed. Clara sighed, finally turning toward him. "Lily has been asking questions. About her father." Something inside him twisted at that. "What did you tell her?" Clara hesitated, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "At first, I told her that families come in different shapes. That some children have mommies and daddies together, and some don't. But she's smart, Edward. She didn't stop asking. She wanted to know if you were out there. If you even knew about her." Edward exhaled, looking down at Lily, who was still focused on her tower. The idea that she had spent her short life wondering about him, searching for answers that no one gave her, made his chest ache in a way he wasn't prepared for. "So you brought her here," he said quietly. Clara nodded. "I didn't know if we'd run into you, but I think part of me hoped we would." Edward turned back to her, something unreadable in his expression. "Would you have ever told me?" Clara swallowed, her fingers tightening slightly against the armrest of her chair. "I don't know," she admitted. "I wanted to. I almost did, so many times. But I was scared." Edward wasn't sure if he wanted to hear her reasons. But at the same time, he knew he needed to. "Scared of what?" She looked down at her hands. "That you'd hate me. That you'd hate her or that you'd try to take her away." Edward felt a sharp pang of guilt. He had spent so much of his life believing that control equaled security, that power meant never being vulnerable. Had he really become the kind of man who Clara had feared would use his influence against her? "I would never have done that," he said, his voice steady. Clara looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his. "I wanted to believe that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There were too many years of silence between them, too many things left unsaid. Then, Lily's tower collapsed with a quiet clatter, and she let out a small, disappointed sigh. Edward leaned down, carefully picking up the plastic cups and stacking them again. "Want to try again?" he asked. Lily looked at him for a second, then gave a small nod. She reached out, her little fingers brushing against his as she took the cup from his hand. It was a simple moment, but to Edward, it meant everything. Clara watched them, something softening in her expression. Maybe she had been right to be afraid back then. Maybe he hadn't been ready. But he was ready now. And he wasn't going to waste another second. Edward had never been patient. His entire life had been built on immediate action, on decisive moves that left no room for hesitation. He was a man who set goals and achieved them, who never let time slip away unnoticed. But now, he was realizing that patience was the only thing that would earn him what truly mattered. Lily was beginning to trust him, but it was happening in small, careful steps. She still looked to Clara for reassurance every time he spoke, still hesitated before answering his questions. But she was letting him in, little by little. She let him sit beside her at breakfast without inching closer to her mother. She let him help her pick out colors when she was drawing in her sketchbook. She let him hold the door open for her without looking unsure about whether she should walk through. They were small things, but Edward held on to them as victories. One afternoon, he found himself standing outside the hotel's garden courtyard, watching as Lily crouched near a row of flowers. She was running her fingers over the petals, murmuring something under her breath that he couldn't quite hear. Clara was sitting on a bench a few feet away, giving Lily space but watching her with the quiet attentiveness of a mother who was always aware of her child's every move. Edward walked over slowly, careful not to startle Lily. "What are you doing?" he asked, keeping his voice light. Lily glanced up at him before looking back at the flowers. "Talking to the bees," she said matter-of-factly. Edward raised an eyebrow. "Oh. What are they saying?" Lily pursed her lips in thought. "They're busy, so they don't talk a lot. But I think they like the flowers." Edward crouched down beside her, observing the tiny bees flitting between blossoms. He had never taken the time to notice things like this before. His world had always been too fast, too demanding. But now, sitting here with his daughter, slowing down didn't seem like such a bad thing. "Do you like flowers?" he asked. Lily nodded. "Mama says they make people happy." Edward glanced toward Clara, who was watching them but pretending not to listen. He turned back to Lily. "She's right. They do." Lily considered this for a moment, then pointed to a small, pale purple flower. "That one's my favorite." Edward smiled. "I remember you said you liked purple." Lily looked at him in surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to remember such a small detail. She didn't say anything, but something shifted in her expression, something softer. Edward let the moment sit between them, not pushing, not rushing. After a while, Lily stood up, dusting off her dress. "I'm hungry," she announced. Clara took this as her cue to stand as well. "We should go inside," she agreed. "It's almost time for lunch." Edward hesitated for only a second before speaking. "Why don't we eat together?" Clara looked at Lily, silently asking for her opinion. Lily tilted her head, thinking, then nodded. "Okay." It wasn't an enthusiastic yes, but it wasn't a no either. Edward took it as progress. They walked inside together, and for the first time since learning the truth, Edward felt something settle inside him. Maybe he wasn't just a stranger anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to become something more. Edward was beginning to realize that trust wasn't something he could demand. It was something he had to earn, piece by piece, moment by moment. And with Lily, every small victory mattered. Over the next few days, their interactions became more natural. She still had her quiet moments, still hesitated sometimes before speaking to him, but the uncertainty in her eyes was fading. She no longer clung to Clara as tightly when he was near. She no longer kept a physical distance between them as if unsure of his presence. One morning, he arrived at breakfast to find Lily already seated at their usual table, a plate of pancakes in front of her. Clara was pouring a cup of coffee, looking more relaxed than she had in days. Edward pulled out his chair and sat down, watching as Lily carefully spread syrup over her pancakes. "Are those any good?" he asked. Lily glanced up at him, chewing thoughtfully before nodding. "They're okay." Edward smirked. "Just okay." She considered for a moment before adding, "They'd be better with strawberries." Edward nodded seriously. "I'll remember that next time." Lily studied him, as if trying to decide whether he really meant it. Then, without saying anything, she pushed her plate slightly toward him. "You can have some if you want." Edward felt something in his chest tighten. It was such a simple gesture, but coming from her, it meant more than she probably realized. He picked up his fork, cutting a small piece before taking a bite. "Not bad," he said. "But I think you're right. Strawberries would make them better." Lily gave a small, pleased smile before returning to her breakfast. Clara, who had been watching the exchange quietly, gave Edward a knowing look. It was the first time Lily had willingly shared something with him, and they both knew it. After breakfast, they decided to take a walk along the beach. The resort's private shoreline was quiet, the waves lapping gently against the sand. Lily walked between them, her small hand occasionally reaching for Clara's as they strolled. Edward watched as she bent down to pick up a seashell, turning it over in her hands before holding it up. "This one's pretty," she said. Edward took it from her, examining it. "It is. Do you like collecting shells?" Lily nodded. "Mama says they're like little memories from the ocean." Edward handed the shell back to her. "Then you should keep it." Lily hesitated for only a second before slipping it into the pocket of her dress. Then, in a move that caught him completely off guard, she reached out and took his hand. It was a small, fleeting touch, just her little fingers wrapping around his for a moment before she let go and ran ahead, laughing as the water splashed near her feet. Edward stood there, frozen, feeling something inside him shift. Clara, beside him, smiled softly. "She's getting used to you," she murmured. Edward let out a slow breath, watching as Lily danced along the shoreline. "I think I'm getting used to her too," he admitted. And for the first time in his life, business, power, and success didn't seem like the most important things in the world. She did. Edward had spent his entire life believing that success was measured in numbers. Revenue, acquisitions, market shares, those were the things he had built his world around. But standing on the beach, watching Lily pick up seashells with a look of pure delight on her face, he realized that maybe he had been wrong all along. The rest of the afternoon passed in a way that felt almost surreal. They walked along the shore, Lily running ahead every few minutes to chase the waves before sprinting back to show him another treasure she had found buried in the sand. Each time, she looked up at him with a little more trust in her eyes, as if she was slowly beginning to believe that he wasn't going anywhere. By the time the sun began to set, they had collected a small pile of shells, which Lily carefully arranged on the wooden deck near the beach chairs. She sat cross-legged, inspecting each one before sorting them into groups. Edward watched, fascinated by the way she focused so intently on something so simple. Clara sat beside him, a warm breeze lifting strands of her dark hair as she glanced between them. "She's never had this before," she said softly. Edward turned to her, his brow furrowing. "Had what?" Clara hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. "A father figure. Someone who's present. Someone who looks at her the way you do." Edward swallowed hard, not sure how to respond to that. He had spent years convincing himself that family wasn't something he needed, that love and relationships were distractions that would only slow him down. But looking at Lily now, he felt an ache for all the moments he had missed. "I can't change the past," he finally said. "But I can be here now. If you'll let me." Clara looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. "And what happens when we leave this place?" Edward exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had been thinking about that too. Their time at the resort had felt like an isolated bubble, a temporary escape from reality. But he didn't want this to end when they checked out of their hotel rooms. "I don't want this to be temporary," he said. "I want to be in her life. Not just for a few days, not just as a distant figure she barely knows, I want to be her father. Really be there for her." Clara studied him for a long moment before speaking. "That means showing up, Edward. Not just when it's convenient, not just when it fits into your schedule. She's not a business deal you can negotiate. She's a little girl who needs stability, who needs to know that the people in her life won't walk away." Edward nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know that. And I want to prove to you that I can do this. That I can be what she needs." Clara searched his face, and for the first time, he saw the last traces of her hesitation fade. "Then prove it," she whispered. Before he could respond, Lily ran up to them, holding something tightly in her hands. "Look," she said, opening her small fingers to reveal a tiny, perfectly shaped white shell. "This one is special." Edward leaned forward, taking the shell gently from her hand. "It's beautiful," he said. Why is it special? Lily tilted her head, thinking. Because it's the last one I found today. It's like a lucky shell. Edward smiled, his chest tightening at the innocence in her words. Then I think we should keep it, he said. As a reminder. Lily nodded eagerly, then, without hesitation, she climbed onto his lap, resting her head against his chest. Edward felt his breath catch. It was the first time she had come to him on her own, without prompting, without Clara's reassurance. It was a silent gesture, but it meant everything. Clara watched them, and when Edward looked at her, he saw something shift in her expression, something that looked a lot like acceptance. For the first time in his life, Edward Sterling felt like he had finally found something worth holding on to. And this time, he wasn't going to let it go. The beauty of this ending lies in its quiet, yet deeply emotional resolution. It's not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations but about something far more meaningful: commitment, trust, and the slow rebuilding of relationships. Edward Sterling begins this story as a man who defines success by power and control, believing that emotional attachments only serve as distractions. But by the end, he learns that true success isn't about what he builds in the boardroom but what he nurtures in his personal life. Lily's gradual acceptance of Edward is what makes this journey so powerful. She doesn't immediately embrace him as her father, and that's what makes her trust feel so real. It comes in small moments, allowing him to sit next to her at breakfast, sharing her pancakes, reaching out for his hand without fear. The most touching moment is when she willingly climbs onto his lap, resting against him as if she finally believes he's someone she can rely on. That single gesture carries more weight than words ever could. Clara's role is equally important. She is not just a love interest, she is a mother fiercely protecting her child's well-being. Her hesitation isn't born out of spite but out of years of uncertainty. She needs to see that Edward is truly willing to stay, that he won't walk away when things get difficult. And when she finally tells him to prove it, she is giving him the opportunity to be the father Lily deserves, rather than making that choice for him. What makes this ending feel so fulfilling is that it doesn't rush into a perfect resolution. Edward doesn't magically fix everything overnight, and the story doesn't conclude with an unrealistic, happily ever after. Instead, it ends on the promise of something real: a father who is finally stepping up, a mother who is beginning to trust again, and a little girl who is learning that love doesn't have to come with conditions. This is a story about second chances, about making up for lost time, and about the realization that family isn't just about blood, it's about showing up, about being there, about choosing to love, even when it's difficult. And in the end, Edward doesn't just find a daughter, he finds something far more valuable. He finds a purpose that no amount of wealth or success could ever replace.